Dissolution occurs when the partnership ends. That doesn't necessarily mean the business owned by the partnership ends. It just means the partnership relationship as it existed till now is being fundamentally changed or is being ended. So, for example, if there's a restaurant and A, B, C, and D, our people are running this, let's say this barbecue restaurant, let's say for argument's sake, the restaurant might still exist, but the partnership could be dissolved. The partnership could be dissolved either because it was only established for a limited time in the first place. Let's say the partnership was only established for 5 years. Well, then, of course, the partnership dissolved after 5 years, even if there's actually business being run by the partnership. Another example would be if a partner decides to opt out. A partner decides to withdraw. The general rule is, unless established differently by the partnership agreement, as soon as one partner withdraws, the partnership is considered dissolved. Or when there's a vote to dissolve. Sometimes the partnership could vote to change the structure of the partnership. That could be because it's not working out, or it could be because it is working out and they want to reform as something else. Instead of using a general partnership form, they want to become an LLC, or they want to become a corporation, or they want to become some other form of business. Well, the first thing you got to do is you have to end the previous relationship, end the general partnership. So what happens when you end a general partnership? Again, it could be because of a good reason, or it could be because of a bad reason, or anything in between. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that the entire business is coming to a crashing halt. Well, the process by which a partnership is ended is called the winding up. This is the process of liquidating the partnership assets and distributing the proceeds to satisfy claiming against the partnership, and then settling up, essentially, among the partners. Again, this doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to distribute the money. Maybe you're going to take the money and reform it into a new business entity, but the stage of winding up occurs whenever a partnership is dissolved, which essentially occurs whenever a partner withdraws or whenever the people in the partnership vote to fundamentally change the structure. Okay, so first thing you do is, what do you do with the partnership assets? Partnership's got a bank account. Partnership has a plant. It has inventory. It has a store. It has intellectual property. It has whatever property it has. What do you do with that money? Well, the first thing you do is, if there are creditors, they get paid first. If there's a bank, if they have credit cards, if they took out a loan, whatever it is, they get paid first. Then, once you've paid off the creditors, assuming that there's money left, you pay the partners who are creditors. Sometimes partners lend money to the company. Well, they don't have first priority. Outside creditors have first priority, but then they've got next priority. Once that's done, you pay off whatever capital contributions there were. Capital contributions means the amount invested in the partnership by the partners. If, for example, you have A, B, C, and D, and A invested $100,000 into the partnership, and B invested $50,000, and C invested $20,000, and D invested $10,000, well, they might be equal partners anyway because maybe they have different levels of expertise. For whatever reason, they're equal partners. Still, when you're winding up, A gets his or her 100,000 first, and B's 50,000, etc. And then once they all get paid off, whatever's left over is now profits. Whatever's left over, the creditors have already been paid, the loans have already been paid from the other partners, capital contributions have been paid, and now it's time to divvy up whatever profits there are. As we discussed before, just because a partnership is dissolved doesn't mean that it's necessarily over, that there's no more business necessarily going to be conducted by these people. You can continue after the dissolution if you like. You can even make a continuation agreement, which says, okay, after everything is distributed, or after some of the debts are distributed, depending on what the partners want to do, they can continue as a partnership with either new members or a subset of the previous members, etc. Or you can have the old partnership dissolved and an entirely new partnership created, or a new corporation created, or a new LLC created, or anything to that effect. If all the creditors are not paid off, if you're forming a new entity and you just didn't have enough money to pay off the creditors, well, then the old creditors, the banks, the credit cards, whatever it is, become creditors, which means people who are owed money by the new entity, by the new partnership. What about outgoing partners? And the answer is, of course, another logical rule. Just because a partnership is dissolved does not necessarily end the liability that already existed for that partner in terms of previous debts or antecedent debts, as we saw before. So if A, B, C, and D owe $100,000 because there was some lawsuit or because they signed an agreement to lease some space or for whatever reason, D decides to leave the partnership and therefore the whole thing is dissolved, that doesn't get D off the hook. If it did get D off the hook, well, then any partner who was in debt would simply dissolve the partnership and that would be it. D is still personally liable, and that personal liability is in the form of joint and several liability. So D theoretically could be on the hook for the entire thing. If A, B, and C don't pay their share. So just because D is leaving the partnership doesn't absolve D of whatever liability there was. Again, a fairly commonsensical rule that is really necessary in order to make sure that people can't simply get out of whatever liability they had. Next issue is, okay, let's say a partner dies. Well, what happens to his or her share? The default rule for a partnership, and this could be changed by the agreement, is what is called a right of survivorship. Now, there are really two different types of arrangements in this respect. Some types of businesses or entities, or you could write in the agreement that if one partner dies, his or her share goes to his or her family. That is called an arrangement where there is no right of survivorship. Right of survivorship means that the remaining account holders or the remaining partners would get his or her share. I mean, just to give you an example of how this would work when you're talking about a bank account, if a bank account has right of survivorship, so let's say you've got A and B have a bank account, a joint bank account, which has a right of survivorship. So when A dies, B becomes the sole account holder and B holds the entire thing. On the other hand, if they're holding assets in a way that there's no right of survivorship, well, then A's share doesn't go to B. A's share instead go to A's heirs, A's family, or whatever A's will says. So the default rule, unless stated otherwise, is that when you're talking about a partnership, there is a right of survivorship, but it could be changed by the agreement. You have to look at the partnership agreement, if there is a partnership agreement, and if the partnership agreement says there is a right of survivorship, well then if the first partner dies, it goes to his or her heirs. If the agreement says that there's no right of survivorship, well then if a partner dies, the assets or the partnership interests go to if there is a right of survivorship, it goes to the other partners, and if there's no right of survivorship, then it goes to the deceased partner's heirs. Of course, after the death of the last partner, well, then it would have to go to the deceased partner's legal representative, like the executor, or really eventually to the family, or to the heirs of the last partner, for the simple reason that there's nobody left for it to go. Even if there's a right of survivorship, there are no survivors if the last partner dies. All right, let us take a look as we end our discussion of general partnerships, of an example of a winding up of a distribution. Okay, so let's take a look at an example, then we're going to look at the solutions for each of these examples. Bart, Lisa, and Maggie have a partnership with no written agreement, so we're going to look at the default rules, in other words, the ones that we have just discussed in the last few minutes. Bart contributed $500,000 to the partnership, Lisa contributed $300,000, and Maggie $100,000. If the partnership dissolves with $1.5 million in the bank and no debts, how much will each party receive? Second one, if there's no assets or debts, what will happen to the parties? Or D, what if there's $1.2 million in debts? What does each have to pay? Well, remember, the first thing that gets paid are the debts of the company. So and then the second thing, after the debts of the company, you have to give back the capital contributions. And the third thing, if the capital contributions are given out and there's still money left, then it's split among the partners. So let's take a look at each of these in turn. Let's take a look at number one. partnership dissolves with 1.5 million in the bank and no debts. How much will each party receive? Well, here's our solution. Each partner has to get back his or her original capital contribution. Now, Bart contributed 500,000, so he takes the first 500,000. Lisa contributed 300,000, so she gets the next 300,000. Maggie gets her 100,000. Now, if you subtract, that's 900,000 paid out. So there's 600,000 left. That 600,000 left is now profit. So that profit gets split three ways, 200 to each. So if you have a calculator or you have a pen, you could write it out and see if you can figure out the same thing as the way I did it. But Bart has 700,000 altogether. His original 500,000 contribution plus the 200,000 in profits that were split equally. Lisa gets 500,000 altogether. Her original 300,000 and 200,000 of the profits. Maggie gets 300,000, which is her $100,000 capital contribution plus her $200,000 share. What about number 2? If the partnership dissolves with no assets or debts? Well, remember the capital contributions are considered partnership debts. So the partners essentially have to contribute enough to pay the debts. There's $900,000 in debts here because the Bart is owed 500,000, Lisa's owed 300,000, and Maggie's owed 100,000. So that's $900,000 in debts. So of that $900,000, each party has to contribute essentially 300,000 to the pot, to the middle, so that they can each be paid back. So Bart put 300,000 in the pot, but gets to take 500,000 out because he's getting his $500,000 back. Lisa, of course, breaks even. She has to put 300,000 into the pot in order to pay everybody, but she gets her $300,000 back. And Maggie, of course, who only made a $100,000 capital contribution, has to pay 200,000 because she's got to put 300,000 in the pot and only gets 100,000 left. The third example, on the other hand, obviously this partnership hasn't done too well. The partnership has no assets and 1.2 million in debts. Who has to pay what? Well, if you think about it, there's really $2.1 million in debts, 1.2 in debts to the outside, and then 900,000 in debts within the partnership. So essentially, each person has to put 700,000 in the middle in order to make up that 2.1 million. Bart puts in 700,000 and then gets $500,000 back because that was his capital contribution. Lisa puts in 700,000 but then gets 300 back for a net payment of 400,000. Maggie's net payment is, of course, 600,000. And again, if you have trouble understanding what this example is, I would recommend maybe pausing it, go back to the original example, see if you can come to the same conclusion. I think once you understand that each partner has to pay for debts, which include capital contributions, it should be fairly easy to calculate.